Fall River is known even by non-true crime fans for the infamous murders of Andrew and Abby Borden and the trial of Andrew's daughter, Lizzie. But 60 years before that, the town was rocked by another murder, and that case is at the center of a new true crime book called The Sinners All Bow. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines and this bonus episode. I'm calling it a bonus episode because I'm technically still on break from the holidays, so this episode shouldn't exist just yet, but I'm also in Kansas City and I'm snowed in, so might as well get it done. If you are new to Crimelines, we're going to do something a little different today because I'm going to give an overview of the case, and then you are going to hear an interview that I did with Kate Winkler Dawson, who is the author of the new book, The Sinners All Bow. I get emails from publishers constantly to see if I want to interview an author who has a new book coming out. I have two rules that determine who I say yes to. One, the author has to be a podcaster, and two, their book and/or podcast have to be in true crime. I know I have a lot of readers in my audience, but I also know that 100% of my listeners like podcasts and like true crime. So I want these episodes where I interview people based on a book they have coming out to have value to everyone, even those of you who are never going to read the book. That's why you see interviews in my feed with people like Laura Norton, the host of The Fall Line, and Paul Holes, the co-host of Buried Bones. Even if you're not that interested in the book, you'll probably be interested in the podcast. So in this episode, I talked to Kate Winkler Dawson, who is the co-host of Buried Bones and the host of Wicked Words. You will hear Kate talk more about the podcast in a minute when I play the interview, but I wanted to first start with the case at the heart of her new book, The Sinners All Bow, since that's most of what we talk about, and you're going to need this context before you jump into our conversation. This case goes back to 1832 in Fall River, Massachusetts. Though the Lizzie Borden case certainly eclipsed this one eventually, it was a pretty big deal at the time and in the decades after. Sarah Cornell was a single woman working in the mills of New England. It seems like she was pretty skilled because she could always find work even though she moved frequently. In May of 1828, when she was in her mid-20s, Sarah moved to Lowell, Massachusetts, where she met a Methodist minister named Ephraim Avery. Now, I don't know if in the 1830s in Massachusetts he would have said Ephraim or Ephraim or Ephraim, so I'm just going to call him Avery because I really don't know how he would have pronounced his name. We know that they definitely knew each other. He would have been her main minister or pastor at the time, but it's not clear how well they knew each other. There's some rumors that she lived with the family for a period of time, but again, it's not clear. In this time period, if you were moving from one area to another, you could have your pastor write you a letter of good standing in the church so that when you moved, you could just join the new congregation without issue. Sarah, when she left Lowell in 1830, wanted such a letter, but Avery would not write one for her, no matter how much she asked. In fact, he seemed a bit determined to make sure that the other churches did not accept her as a member in good standing. In spite of that, Sarah was not going to be deterred from living her faith, and she was still active in the Methodist Church. In August of 1832, Sarah was living north of Fall River, Massachusetts, and she traveled to Connecticut for a Methodist camp meeting. You're going to hear Kate and I talk about it a little in the interview, but this time period is known as the Second Great Awakening, and at the time, the Methodist Church was not viewed as a mainstream Protestant religion, but rather a newer religion that held long prayer meetings and tent revivals and days-long camp meetings. At this camp meeting, Sarah did see Reverend Avery. Well, he later said he wasn't there, but he almost surely was. And according to Sarah, they were seeing each other for the first time in a couple of years, but they did have on and off contact by letter as Sarah was trying to get that acknowledgement of good standing. In order to try to get that, she did write out her confessions to Avery and mailed them to him in an act of repentance. If you read the Wikipedia article on this case and a lot of other writings, it says that Sarah alleged that Avery seduced her while at the camp meeting. But that is not what Sarah alleged. She said that he raped her, and from what I'm reading about it, it sounds like he was offering to burn her confession letters in an act of coercion, and then he forced himself on her. Sarah, as was common at the time and not so uncommon today, she picked herself up from the attack and tried to move on. She was not going to say anything until she found out she was pregnant. By the time she realized it, it was October of 1832, and she had gone to see a local doctor. She confided in him about what had happened at the camp meeting, and he recommended that she move just over the state line into Rhode Island, which was the state where Avery lived. This would make it a lot easier for her to pursue some type of child support. She ended up living in a part of Rhode Island that is now included in Fall River, Massachusetts, after some later boundary changes. Sarah had told her family through letters about her pregnancy, and of course she had written to Avery about it as well. All of the letters indicated that she planned to raise her child, and she even mentioned in one letter her options for childcare. She really hoped that Avery would step up and help with enough support that she could manage things. It appears, however, that Avery made no acknowledgement of paternity in the time between October and December of 1832, though Sarah did receive a few anonymous letters arranging a meeting between her and this anonymous letter writer. And she went to the arranged meeting at a local farm on December 20th, 1832. Sarah did not return to her boarding house that night, and in the morning, the man who owned the farm found Sarah's body hanging from a haystack pole. The initial thought of those at the scene was that Sarah had taken her own life. Her doctor told them about the pregnancy, and they assumed that she was so distraught over her situation that she decided she couldn't go on. But then, when the women in town were preparing Sarah's body for burial, they saw significant bruising. The men hadn't seen these bruises because they thought it was improper to undress a woman's body like that, so they didn't even look. But the bruises to these women indicated that Sarah had been attacked before she died, which opened up the possibility that she was killed and the scene was staged. An investigation was done to 1830 standards, and they found those anonymous letters in Sarah's belongings that arranged a meeting. And they also found a note that Sarah left behind that said, if she went missing, inquire of Reverend Avery, quote, he will know where I am, end quote. Sarah had told enough people that Avery was the baby's father, and the fetal age at autopsy indicated that she did get pregnant around the time of the Thompson camp meeting. Her story was adding up, so they decided to arrest Avery for murder. Knowing he was a suspect and that public opinion was not in his favor, Avery had fled the area. They eventually found him in New Hampshire about a month after Sarah's death and took him into custody. The trial occurred just a few months later in May of 1833, and the defense was that Avery didn't do it. He didn't do any of it. He never raped Sarah. He was not the father of her baby. In fact, he was never even at that camp meeting. He never met with her, and he didn't kill her. What happened was that Sarah was angry at Avery, not for a rape or for not acknowledging paternity, but because he had essentially kicked her out of the church. So she decided to take her own life and frame it to look like he killed her. They even said she wrote the anonymous notes herself to fake this meeting. But I have to ask, if she was trying to frame someone, why did she make the notes anonymous? If you're going to forge notes, at least sign a name. Anyway, they put on witnesses to say that Sarah was an unstable and immoral woman who talked about suicide in the past. Many of these witnesses were people who knew Sarah. Some of them were her friends from the factory, and I think the most important thing to note here is that they were all Methodist. The church was absolutely circling the wagons around Avery. If part of the defense was that Sarah was unstable and immoral, you would think that because she wrote her confession letters to Avery, he would have admitted those into evidence. But he didn't, because he didn't have them any longer. To me, this backs up Sarah's story that he said he would burn them if she slept with him, and he burned them even though the encounter ended up not being consensual in any way. The defense then tried to dispel the forensic evidence, if we want to call it that we had at the time. They said that the fetal age was not definitive and in fact showed she got pregnant at a time other than the camp meeting. As for the bruises on her body, the matrons who prepared her for burial were just women who were dressing someone. They were not medical experts. What they saw as bruising could very well have just been decomposition. And given that this was a time before the good people of Fall River could snap some photographs, all the state had were witness descriptions of the marks and not actual pictures. Avery's alibi for the night of the murder was that he went for a long walk. They couldn't find anyone who saw him on this walk, but then again, the defense does not have to prove an alibi. The state has to prove that Avery was at the crime scene, and they couldn't. The closest they got were some people who saw a figure wearing a brimmed hat like Avery wore nearby, but that just was not enough. And the jury found Avery not guilty. Maybe Sarah met with someone else that night. Maybe she did meet Avery and he denied paternity and refused her support, leaving her so distraught that she decided to take her own life. I mean, that's not what I think happened, but I can see why a jury decided the way they did. There is reasonable doubt here. A lot of people disagreed with the verdict to the point that Avery and his family left New England entirely and settled in Ohio, where people did not know his name or his past. A year after Sarah's death and months after the trial, Catherine Williams published her book, Fall River, an authentic narrative that covered the case. She attended the trial and had access to firsthand interviews and reported the case in a way that was not common at the time. Instead of telling a sensational, gore-filled, embellished tale that was common, she gave an accurate recounting, though with a little bit of her own biases written in. In fact, it really reminds me of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. We talk about that being the beginning of the modern true crime book. He was absolutely influenced in his writing based on his own feelings about things. And so if we're looking at it in that context, I'm going to say that Catherine Williams was probably 130 years ahead of her time in the style and format of her Fall River book. All that to say that this case has been explored before in writing, both in Catherine Williams' book and others since then. But what Kate Winkler Dawson does in The Sinners All Bow is take a new look at the case and the reporting on the case by using a modern lens. She interviews Paul Holes, her co-host for the podcast Buried Bones, about various pieces of evidence and the forensics. She ends up hiring a handwriting comparison expert to figure out who wrote those anonymous notes. Not only did Sarah Cornell and Reverend Avery leave behind enough letters for this comparison, Sarah had recounted at least one of those anonymous notes in another letter, so we have the note in her own handwriting to compare it to, which is just not common. Kate was also able to look at the entire case with some historical distance and in that context. So we're talking the textile mills and what that represented for women to be able to make their own money, as well as the changes in the religious landscape and the establishment versus the innovators within that space. It absolutely influenced this case, including the trial and the reporting on it. So it really couldn't be left out. And I found it to be one of the strengths of this book is to get all of the surrounding context. There is so much more to uncover in this case, which you can read about in The Sinners All Bow. And to hear more about it in my interview with Kate, just keep listening. I want to first say that your prologue has to be the best nonfiction book prologue I've ever read. Usually they're just such info dumps, and you're like, all right, let's go on this journey. And you grabbed me from the start.
I feel like you have to assume that people don't even read those, because I know a lot of people just skip right over. So I just think I'm not going to put the most important stuff in, but I do like to put personal journey jazz in there. So thank you. I appreciate that. Nobody's ever pointed that out before.
Yeah, usually people skip the prologues because they're info dumps, but I read them because, that's the job. That's the chore, is you got to get the context first, then you can move on. And with the way you started talking about your co-author, and then, it's just great. I'm going to leave it for my readers to experience firsthand. I don't want to give it away, but honestly, I've never had a prologue grab me like that. So I did want to point that out.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. This is an excellent start, I have to say.
So you are kind of in the podcast world, the expert on historic cases. You cover a lot of them. Mm-hmm. So out of all of the historic cases you've come across in your time as a podcaster, why did you choose this one?
I think that, this case, well, actually, going back to how I found this case, I had a listener it wasn't Barry Bones, it was one of the other shows, it was Tenfold More Wicked, emailed me and said, you should really look at the haystack murder case. And I said, okay. So I Googled it, and up pops the story of Sarah Maria Cornell, the woman who was found in 1832 hanging from a haystack pole in New England. And that was not the case she wanted me to look at. There's a different haystack case. I think it's in Kansas in the 1930s, I think, but that was the wrong case. But I got onto this case, and I think I write an awful lot about men killing women. I mean, that's just true crime in general. I think we have a lot of those cases. Yeah. Anything else of women killing men, or, other things that kind of I feel a little bit more like outliers. So I really wanted to concentrate on a case where I could try to bring the victim back to life and figure out what she represented. Because when we talk about this case, oftentimes I think it is attached to this epic battle between the Congregationalists, the very traditional mainstream Protestant church, versus in America in the 1800s, versus the Methodists, which, hang on to your hats, were wild in the 1800s. I mean, they were wild with tent revivals and sex and alcohol, and all this on and on. Not what I expected from the Methodists. And I think that Sarah Cornell and the man who was the suspect in this case, who was a Methodist minister, are often sort of like framed as the avatars of this battle between these two people, when really what this story boiled down to me, was a woman who was pregnant, who was demanding, what she needed from the man who was responsible for this. And this was she was standing up for her rights, and she was demanding respect, and she ended up dead. So I think there's a lot more to the story than just this, battle between the Methodists and the Congregationalists. It goes much deeper. To me, I look for heroes in stories like this. And the heroes for me were women, the matrons who found the violent marks on her to begin with, when the men ignored them because there was an impropriety about undressing her. So it was the women who sounded the alarm, but it was also women on the stand who just destroyed her reputation for no reason but to protect, a church and a minister. So I have I feel like protagonists and antagonists, and they're all women. And it just shows sort of the history of that victim shaming. I mean, awfulness, starting with Hester Prynne, with Nathaniel Hawthorne using Sarah Maria Cornell as sort of the prototype for Hester Prynne in Scarlet Letter.
One of the things we talk about when we talk about writing is, building out things that are not characters into characters. And in this book, you had a lot of possibilities there because we have the mills and the culture of women working in the mills, young women, and even women into their 30s. We have the Methodist revivals and camps. We have Fall River, which has its own, it has several infamous cases. One I'm going to be covering on my podcast coming up about satanic panic, that there are so many things here, but your book would have been 500-600 pages if you build them all out. So how did you choose really what to bring to life and what to just kind of explain the context and move on?
When I teach writing, I teach at the University of Texas, and I teach students writing. I kind of do this weird thing where I draw a circle and I say, this is our spider, and it's the abdomen, and then you've got all these little legs coming off of it. And I think that where we get derailed in storytelling sometimes is, you've got to write that thing in the center of your spider. What is this story about? And I write it, and then I have little legs that come off, and these are like the details, like what you're talking about, the tent revival, where some of this took place, where you've got like the courthouse and the scene there, you've got life on farms, all of these different things that you could really go down some pretty deep rabbit holes. But I always have to look at the abdomen of the spider and just say, but it doesn't serve this story. So I can touch on it, but I can't go down that rabbit hole. So I have this one theme, which is what contributed not just to Sarah Cornell's death in 1832, but what contributed to the legacy of what was left behind. I mean, boy, do I write about women who are way more famous dead than they ever were alive. And Sarah Maria Cornell wrote down her innermost thoughts and fears, her vulnerabilities in letters, and to her family that she never intended to have, 100,000 readers read in a book. So, I have to think about all of those things and focus in what's in the middle of that spider, which is, this is her story. How do we get to a place where you have a woman sitting on the stand who once worked with her, a prim and proper woman with her ankles crossed, and she says, Sarah Maria Cornell was a slut, and she's not worth having this trial over? How do we get to that point? And how is that still happening,
And I think letting the readers know what the Methodist Church was then was really important because, in a lifetime ago at this point, I studied American Sign Language. And in sign language, the sign for Methodist is rubbing your hands together because they were enthusiastic. And I thought, that is the oddest thing I've ever heard. I don't think of Methodists as particularly enthusiastic above any other mainstream Protestant church. It's interesting, the development of religion. But until I read your book, I had no idea why rubbing your hands together and Methodist being enthusiastic meant anything. But American Sign Language was emerging at the same time. So that is where they're getting the sign from.
That's amazing. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that in interviews. That's great.
Yeah. Now you know. Good. But it was so fascinating.
It's like when you hear, terrible, a phrase, that I used all the time, rule of thumb, and then you find out what that actually means and why we don't use rule of thumb anymore about the size of the rod that a man was able to use to beat his wife. I think when you find out things like that, it does make sense. Yeah, the Methodist, my agent, who I adore, grew up Methodist, and she kept saying, kind of like, really? Are you serious? They would get drunk. They called there was a phrase called tent babies because so many people got pregnant during these revivals. I don't think evangelical and Methodist ever really went together. And I don't know if that's what John Wesley envisioned when he came to America initially and brought Methodism. There were the circuit riders who rode from place to place and sort of, it's particularly in the West, trying to recruit people. And they teamed up with the Baptists, which also seemed like an odd teaming up, but it happened. And the way that the religion developed after that was so interesting. But these are the people who were tarred and feathered because the traditional mainstream, Protestant congregations despise them so much. They did not. And Catherine Williams, my co-author, was like that too. She looked at their like flailing and moaning and passion and super hot ministers who were clearly not formally educated in preaching, and it was repulsive to her and to them. So that I know it's interesting now. Here we are with grape juice in the modern day. That's what my agent said. Really? Okay.
I think it's so interesting, but it also makes me think about, even as a podcaster, how much side research I do into things that never make it into my podcast, or I spend an hour reading up on it and it becomes one sentence. Mm-hmm. So I imagine in this case, between Fall River and the mills and the culture behind that and the religious aspect, you probably did a ton of research that we never get to read about in this book.
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly with the culture of, what the factory culture, I found pretty disturbing. And there were a lot of details. I know I list a couple of newspaper articles about people losing limbs. Mm-hmm. And these are young women coming kind of a lot off of farms, or maybe they were domestic workers and now they're kind of gaining this independence. But it really wasn't independence as far as I was concerned. You know how you had boarding houses where the matrons were telling you what to do, and there's a bell clanging that tells you when the dinner bell is happening, and you're moving from thing to thing, and you're working 14-hour days. And, there was a story, I think it was, they had locked all the doors in a factory, and a fire started, and all of these women were trapped. So there are these awful things, but talk about a rabbit hole. I would have loved to have really gone through the positives in Lowell, Massachusetts, and all of these different places, the positives of the factories, not just in the industrial age and how it changed Americans' lives, developing all of these new things, but really giving women a sense for, like being able to date if they wanted to kind of be away from overbearing. You still had patriarchal society looking over you, but not, Sarah Cornell abandoned the Congregationalist Church and became a Methodist. If she were living at home, I'm not quite sure she would have been able to make a switch like that.
With all this research into the book, was there something that you learned that really surprised you?
Well, besides the stunning revelation of, sex in woods at tent revivals for Methodists, that was pretty much the most stunning thing for me. I think that and Methodist ministers being tarred and feathered. I guess I didn't really realize how much of a threat a new religion would be to the establishment. Mm-hmm. I didn't get it. And, when we talk about Fall River in particular, and you have this murder this death, I don't know. I mean, I think about this, whether or not this was a murder or not. When you have this happen in a place like Fall River, which already has a reputation, that would be earned 60 years later with Lizzie Borden. But when you have something happen in an industrial town like this, and you have Sarah Maria Cornell and the suspect, Ephraim Avery, the Methodist minister, they become avatars for these two religions. I just didn't know how much acrimony there would be. Aren't there enough congregants to kind of like serve everybody? I guess not. I mean, I think that there was so much bitterness coming from, mainstream Protestants toward the Methodists and the Baptists, really the Methodists. I can't even believe, how targeted they were. Ephraim Avery was a sleazebag. I mean, really, I think everything that I read about him, my co-author had a lot of anecdotes that went into her book that were not in the trial. Obviously, they couldn't be admitted, but he was gross. But the Methodist Church really paid a price for this story. So I think that all of that dynamic, I'm not a religious person. So the dynamic between these different sort of factions of religion, I was like, what? This is wild. I mean, aren't there enough people? I guess. I mean,
And to almost see the party lines drawn based on the prosecution's case and the defense case on who their witnesses were. And so it was almost as though the state was putting the church and some of the factors on trial, whereas the defense was putting the victim on trial.
Right. And I think you see that, when you see all of these women who used to work with Sarah Maria Cornell testify for the defense, which just is so stunning to me.
Mm-hmm.
But the motivation of all of these women who were supposedly her friends, I just can't even imagine if her seeing this and just realizing Sarah Worthing and all of these people taking the stand, accusing her of sleeping with her brother-in-law. I mean, saying that she was suicidal all the time. I just like on, just destroying her character, I think was really hurtful as a woman, hurtful for me. I think there's telling the truth. And then there is really impugning someone. And it was gross. And then in the book, I say this, I interviewed an attorney who represents sexual harassment victims. And she said, I sent her the trial transcripts. And she read 2 of them, really long transcripts. And she said, this defense argument is exactly the kind of argument I hear today. It's different words. It's 19th century words, but it's the same thing. It just repeats. It's still happening.
Yeah, we still have debates over how much of a victim's sexual history is relevant in a trial.
Right.
And, whether she slept with everybody in every town she lived in or she slept with nobody, it doesn't actually change what happened between her and Avery.
Right.
That remains a separate issue altogether. But of course, back then and even today, we're seeing them being, conflated and becoming the same thing. She can say yes to everyone in her past, but if she said no to him, then she said no to him.
Well, I think what's difficult about this story is the defense did an excellent job. The defense, by the way, paid by the Methodist Church. Actually, it was the Methodist Conference, which is the mothership of the Methodist Church. So, I think they did an excellent job, not just framing her as promiscuous, which would have been horrifying in the, 1830s. But what they did was said, she's promiscuous. She was so miserable that Ephraim Avery, this wonderful reverend, would not give her a certificate of good character, meaning she's a good person, let her into your church. He refused to do that she took her own life out of revenge. And then there are women who are on the stand saying, oh yeah, I heard her say, I hate Ephraim Avery. I'm going to do this. I'm going to get revenge on him. Which to me is they're clearly lying. Nobody, any merit actually got on the stand and said that she had said that. But this was not just she deserved it, which is kind of like what we've heard, throughout history. She deserved it. She's wearing a skirt that's too short. This is who she is at her core. She hated herself and she took him down with her. And that is a very believable argument to people in the 1800s. And frankly, it's believable to people now, to some people.
It's interesting to hear them try to portray her as just absolutely emotionally unstable.
Yeah.
And then say for 5-6 months, she planned and executed this perfect crime to try to frame him for her murder. And I'm like, can you pick one? Like, is she unstable or is she diabolical?
Right. And they were able to refute that he was the father of the baby. I mean, they didn't even acknowledge it. They said he wasn't even at that event where she says she was sexually assaulted. So you have this for them, a perfect narrative. It's not even I'm not the father. I mean, which is kind of squishy. It wasn't that. It was, she's mad.
Mm-hmm. And
there were enough people looked at Sarah's situation as a single mother who said, she's probably mad. I mean, I would be mad, So, and she was emotionally unstable. If you read those letters, she was very, very against suicide. I mean, she was so religious. So I think you're sort of gathering all of this evidence and having to make a decision yourself about what happened.
As we're talking about this and he's saying he wasn't even there, well, today we would have a travel record or a logbook to tell us he was there.
CCTV.
Yeah. He would have, Snapchatted his, about it. And so in looking at this case, you decided to look at some of the spots where modern technology and forensics may have been a game changer. But I mean, if you did it at every turn, it would have taken forever.
Yeah.
But what do you think as far as things like DNA, fingerprints? What analysis do you think we have today that could have really benefited this case?
Geofencing would have broken it.
Yeah.
And I had not really, so I teach a true crime podcast class at the University of Texas, and Paul Holes on Barry Bones and I have talked about geofencing. I heard about it first on one of those Oxygen type shows, and it was a really good show on technology, the forensic technology with true crime today. And it was a story about a shooting that happened at a house party, and they had like 4 suspects, and they had just started using geofencing, which is pretty controversial, where they could draw a box around that house and figure out which cell phones were at the house at the time. So, this is under the assumption that this is almost like a crime of passion. You don't know enough to turn off your phone,
right?
Or, leave your phone at home because you don't think you're killing somebody that night. So geofencing would have at least disproven that he was not on that stupid walkabout that he claimed he was on, which is like the worst alibi. I was at home with my wife. The worst alibi ever. Oh yeah, I was watching TV alone.
Absolutely.
I mean, most of us, frankly, don't have good alibis. I mean, if a crime got committed last night, I think I was like out in my cottage in the woods, not doing anything, and nobody knew where I was.
Yeah.
So I think geofencing would have been amazing because, I was teaching this class and one of my students put her hand up and she said, we're in advertising and, they use geofencing all the time in advertising. They know when you walk into Banana Republic and they start popping up things on your phone. And I just thought, what? It's like the Minority Report or something. So I think geofencing would have been interesting because, maybe he would have left his cell phone home or turned it off or something if he met her at John Durfee's land. But at some point, he would have had a cell phone on him. And I think that they would have been able to at least show that he was lying or that they were together. I don't know. I think geofencing, and of course, like DNA, I'm really into forensic botany. I love it. And I think that, they could have used some, maybe on the rope, they could have found pollen I think that somebody brought the rope or some of it maybe had been found. But, I think somebody could have brought the rope and they would have been able to do a little bit of work there. Certainly DNA would have been helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting. The geofencing, I covered a case recently where the guy had his friend kill his wife, but it seems like the guy was trying to chicken out of it. So the husband comes back to the neighborhood when the murder should have already been committed, but it hadn't been. And so they did a cell tower dump and found out he was in the neighborhood when he said he was somewhere else. And so it is interesting that these cell phones, people, even someone who's on their phone constantly turning it off for 4 hours. Just at a time when a murder occurs, that would have been relevant.
It's a criminal profile of a pattern, right? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, but that's still circumstantial evidence. I mean, you really, I don't know. I think DNA is powerful, but I feel like it's like almost every lab has made mistakes at some point, and a good defense attorney can say, yeah, but they screwed up this other case. What about cross-contamination? So I think you need a whole stack of circumstantial things. And I just, at the end, I don't think they could get it across the finish line with this case. I just don't think there was enough for Ephraim Avery because they just could not pin him there. They could not, there was a description of him that I believe was him, but this is the trials and the pains of doing a case in the 1800s. I deal with that with Paul all the time. Paul Holes on Buried Bones, he'll ask me, do we have this? Do we have an autopsy? Do we have that? No, they didn't do fingerprints in 1812, Paul. So, they're so limited. You a lot of times had to catch people literally red-handed to be able to convict them.
Even things that we think of as everyday, I don't even think we think of photographs as technology anymore because they're just such a part of our lives. But if they had photographs of her injuries where the defense is saying those weren't injuries, you're taking the word of these ladies, like they don't know. We could have had photographs, but, obviously there are like big things like DNA and then little things or technology that's been around long enough. We think of it as a little thing that could have really changed that.
Well, I think also, you got DNA. I don't know. I mean, she was wearing her gloves. I mean, I was going to say if she weren't wearing her gloves, there would probably be some
fingernail scrapings.
Fingernail scrapings. Certainly, they would be able to disprove if he was the father of the child or not.
Right.
I mean, that's probably the biggest no-brainer. He said, frankly, I wasn't even there. I don't know what they're talking about. But it's still a lie. And, even this is the problem with the case, I think. Even if we put him there with CCTV, he's there. They're arguing. If he says, we got into an argument, I told her go terminate the pregnancy, I'm not supporting you, and walked off, how would they prove that she did not just take her own life?
Right.
I mean, how do you say that? Or who's to say that some strange guy didn't walk up right behind Ephraim Avery, hop the fence, and kill her? I mean, there's so many steps that you have to overcome with that case, and that made it so hard.
And I feel like I was surprised to find out that I thought this was going to be a case where the jury went back and these 12 men in 2 hours decided, he couldn't have done it. He's a minister. She was promiscuous, whatever. But they really did spend hours and hours deliberating.
Yeah. And it's surprising because cases in the 1830s were like nanoseconds. I mean, it was like a day, and this one dragged on and on and on. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence. The testimonies were very long. They had the classic battle of the experts. Who do you believe? Mm-hmm. She was disinterred twice. So there's autopsy reports. There's so much stuff. And then the character witnesses were just on and on. So at least they did their due diligence. And, quite frankly, they came to the right conclusion for me legally, not morally. But this was, I don't think there was enough to prove, which is the frustrating part. I tell my students all the time, welcome to the criminal justice system. Just because you believe someone's guilty, if you can't prove it, it doesn't matter. And, then my students were like, well, but, you're letting murderers go free. And I said, but we also have innocent people who aren't being wrongly convicted if we think like that. We don't always think like that. And, my dad was a law professor for 37 years. And he said he would rather have 100 killers go free than one innocent person behind bars. And I tend to agree with that, because if that innocent person is your kid, heck yeah, I want that person out. I want him out. I don't want somebody wrongfully convicted. So that is the maddening part of the justice system, is sometimes what you believe cannot be proved.
Which I want to just shift focus a little bit as we wrap up, because obviously we're on a podcast and my listeners are podcast listeners. So even the ones who aren't necessarily, big true crime book readers, I want to talk about your podcast for a second, because I feel like they really overlap into what you did with The Sinners All Bow, because, you have one podcast that's really focused more on journalistic coverage of crime cases. And then you have another one that's looking at historic cases through a modern lens, and you kind of put those together in this book. So can you just tell my listeners about your podcasts?
Sure. So there's 3. One that's been retired, but is still available. That is my original. That's like the OG, Tenfold More Wicked, which is very much like a documentary series, but for audio, where I tackle one case over 6 episodes. There's 12 seasons of that, and it's still available. And these are all on the Exactly Right network, where My Favorite Murder is the mothership of that network. Wicked Words is the one you were talking about, which is, where I interview, just like this, I interview true crime authors about their best stories. And sometimes it's filmmakers, sometimes it's podcasters. Much of the time, though, it is authors. And then the third show, which is probably what is the most well-known, is called Buried Bones. And that's with Paul Holes. And he's a forensic investigator who was one of the people who solved the Golden State Killer case. That's what he's really well known for, besides just being brilliant. And so with that, Buried Bones was the inspiration for the book, because what I do with that story is I sit down and say, or what I do with that show is I sit down with Paul and I say, here's the story I'm going to tell you. It's set in 1812. He knows nothing about the case. And I start unspooling it. I let him get to know the victim. I hide things from him. I know obviously how the story unfolds. And along the way, he'll say, do we have a pathology report? And I'll say, yes. And this is what it said. And I'll say, Paul, do you want to hear about the pathology report first? Or do you want to hear about the guy's alibi? Or do you want to hear about, the forensics that they were running on fingerprints? And he'll say, I always want to hear about the body first. So I'll tell him that. So, with that analysis, that's what really for me inspired The Sinners All Bow, because I had these letters that Sarah Cornell had, read and had convinced her to go out to John Durfee's farm that night because she thought she was going to get child support, and she ended up dead. And so I hired a handwriting expert, one of the best, and I sent her the letters, and she was able to use. It was interesting because at one point Sarah was accused of writing the letters herself, mimicking a different kind of handwriting. And she said what was so interesting was that there's a point where Sarah is copying one of these anonymous letters and sending it to her family word for word. So she said, I've never had that happen where I can read the anonymous letter and read Sarah's handwriting at the same time, and they're saying the exact same things. And she said, it's so clearly not her. It's a different person. So, using those podcasts has been really helpful. Paul is in the book. I have to ask him about the clove hitch knot and all kinds of stuff. And he really is a great guide for me. But I have other experts I talk to also. So, yeah, it's great. I mean, the podcasts, they all work together. It's like some kind of weird machine I can't control of, books and video and everything else. So, yeah, it's great.
So, yeah, I'm going to recommend to my listeners to check out The Sinners All Bow when it comes out. It will be out probably by the time this episode airs. And if not, the pre-order button will be there as well. And so people can check the show notes for that. And then also I'll have your podcasts, current and those that are on hiatus. I always call it a hiatus, even if you've never come back.
Don't put that in the universe. That show just about killed me. So, but okay, we'll go with hiatus. If that makes you happy, we can do that.
So I'll let everyone check out your podcast, and just thank you so much for giving me some of your time this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Great talking to you.